They are enforcing it with great difficulty, as we've been seeing. Look, hundreds of thousands of these migrant laborers in India have essentially, Claire, been left both jobless and homeless by this abrupt 21-day lockdown announced last week by the Indian Prime Minister. And when I say hundreds of thousands, I'm actually underestimating the figure. It's estimated that around 70 to 80% of India's workforce work in what's called the informal sector, and about a third of them are in sort of casual labor jobs. That means they basically earn their pay as they go by the day. They don't have formal contracts, and they rely on these jobs often for their food, for their shelter, for their basic necessities. So when the businesses suddenly go into lockdown or supply restrictions and constraints take hold, these are people who are really at the end of society's tether in terms of having basic protections. That's why we are seeing what can almost be described as, if not an exodus, a stampede out of New Delhi, which is obviously a big hub, a giant hub of these migrant laborers, to try to get back to these villages. Now, the Indian government, Claire, saying at the same time that they are trying to provide relief, and they have passed a $22.5 billion package. Free food handouts, giving gas cylinders to poor families, also trying to boost health care funding, and also giving support to farmers. But a lot of observers in India, human rights workers as well, health officials saying that relief is going to prove far too modest. And at this point right now, what we're seeing, and Indian migrant laborers are voting with their feet, is that their fears essentially of dying of hunger because they don't have access to food, or at least enough food, are outweighing any fears they may have of catching the coronavirus in the process.
Doug, as well as police violence, we've seen stigmatization of the most vulnerable, those who may or may not be infected.
Absolutely. Most vulnerable, I was just talking about the poorest members of society, but the stigmatization also extends to doctors, to nurses, healthcare workers of all kinds, who in many cases are facing evictions, reportedly facing evictions often by landlords who fear that they could spread it to other tenants. In some states, state governments are making the names and even addresses of those who are in quarantine for suspected coronavirus, making them public and thus heightening the risk of them coming under perhaps attack, assault. We've already seen, a lot of vigilante violence earlier against Muslims in India. This coronavirus epidemic is also heightening the stigma attached to many more vulnerable communities and minority communities. Some officials are even marking the homes where individuals are quarantined. And in some cases, people are being forced to hold signs, some human rights organizations reporting, saying, "I am an enemy of society because I will not stay at home." And this is a reference basically to the government urging people to stay at home, that they have their backs. Don't worry, we will provide the food and shelter and basic necessities you need. But as I said earlier, Indians really do not either trust or have faith that their government really does have their backs. So the stigmatization is compounding the sort of life and death calculation. I have to get food now. I need to get food. And the only way I can do that is by getting back to my village. So risking a long journey on the way, often a hazardous journey at the risk of the police violence, which we saw in that report. Basically, human rights organizations saying that the government has to do a lot more to ensure that in the name of preventing the spread of coronavirus, they do not basically flout all human rights protections, and that the most marginalized in society do not end up carrying an unfair burden in trying to face down this virus.